She is the one person on Earth who could confirm or destroy the story Nolan's friends have been telling for weeks. And this week, for the first time, she spoke. Not in an interview, not under oath, through her own mother, in a Facebook post, quietly, without a lawyer standing next to her, and without a camera in her face. And what she said does not match what the friends have been saying since day one. At the same time, in a completely separate development, the FBI entered this case. Two things changed this week. Neither one has gotten the attention it deserves yet. So we're going to slow down, walk through both of them carefully, and do what we've tried to do every single update. Separate what is actually confirmed from what is simply circulating. Because in a case this saturated with theories, that distinction is the only thing that actually matters. Let's get into it. Before we do, a quick note on how we're going to structure this update, because it matters for how you should weigh everything you're about to hear. We're going to separate this into what's officially confirmed, what's being relayed secondhand but from credible sources, and what's still just noise. Those three categories are going to come up again and again in this update, and by the end, you'll understand exactly why that distinction has become the single most important skill for anyone trying to follow this case honestly. This is Midnight Crime Files. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because this case is still developing. And the next confirmed update could change everything we currently know. Let's begin. Jackson County's sheriff gave an update recently, and buried inside it were two details that had never been part of the public record before. First, his department has been conducting formal witness interviews and has been in direct contact with outside agencies, including the FBI. Second, tips from the public have genuinely moved this investigation forward. In his own words, this past week brought in a lot of valuable information after his office specifically asked people to come forward. He called that response productive. He was also direct about where things stand more broadly. This investigation, he said, is active. It's ongoing. Now, if you've been following this case from the beginning, that phrasing should catch your attention, because this is the same sheriff whose earlier comment, "No foul play was suspected," drew so much criticism and confusion. This new update reads completely differently. It's measured, it's procedural, and notably, it avoids repeating any language that could be read as prematurely closing off possibilities. Is that a genuine shift in approach, or a lesson learned from how badly that earlier phrase landed publicly? Honestly, we can't know that from the outside. What we can say for certain is that the language itself has clearly changed. But before this gets overstated, and things in this case tend to get overstated fast, let's be precise about what's actually been confirmed here. The sheriff said his office has been in contact with the FBI. That is a real, meaningful development. It is not the same thing as the FBI taking over this case, and it is not the same thing as a formal federal investigation being opened. Local and state investigations bring in federal agencies for all kinds of reasons. Forensic resources, jurisdictional questions, digital evidence recovery. Contact does not mean the case has transferred to federal hands. What it does suggest is that Jackson County's own investigation has expanded well beyond what a small local sheriff's office typically handles on its own. And when you combine that with an independent autopsy being conducted separately in Washington, D.C., and Trump's earlier public question about whether the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation should take this case over entirely, this is now a case being examined from multiple directions at once, not just one. It's worth understanding generally why a local sheriff's office would reach out to the FBI in a case like this, even without any formal takeover. Federal agencies often bring specialized digital forensics capabilities that smaller departments simply don't have in-house, which is particularly relevant here, given the ongoing questions around deleted phone content. They can also help coordinate across jurisdictions, which matters in a case where witnesses, family members, and now two separate autopsy teams are spread across multiple states. To put that in concrete terms, recovering deleted content from a phone, especially content that's already passed through an app's own automatic deletion window, isn't as simple as running one piece of software and getting an instant answer. It can involve pulling data directly from a device's storage, working with the platform itself to see what, if anything, still exists on their servers, and cross-referencing metadata like timestamps and device logs to establish a sequence of events. That kind of work requires equipment and expertise a small county department typically doesn't keep on staff full-time, simply because they don't need it often enough to justify it. Bringing in federal digital forensics resources for a case like this one isn't unusual. It's often exactly what you'd expect a competent local department to do once a case reaches this level of complexity. None of that confirms any specific federal role yet, but it does mean the contact itself is a fairly ordinary response to a case that has become logistically and forensically complicated, not necessarily a sign that federal civil rights investigators have opened their own separate inquiry. A CNN law enforcement analyst, a former police chief in both Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., offered some useful context on what this stage of an investigation typically looks like. He said it's important to interview each of Nolan's friends individually, one at a time, along with anyone who was on the beach that day, and the young woman Nolan was reportedly talking to. Here's why that separation matters, and it's worth spelling out clearly. When people are interviewed together, or even just aware of what others in their group have already said, their own account can shift, consciously or not, to align with the group's version. Separating witnesses removes that pressure. It lets investigators compare independent accounts of the same afternoon and look specifically for the places where those accounts naturally overlap versus the places where they start to pull apart. In a case built almost entirely on competing accounts of who said what to whom, that individual interviewing process isn't just standard procedure. Right now, it's arguably the single most important tool investigators have, more so than physical evidence, given how much of this still hinges on memory and conversation rather than forensics. The same analyst made a broader point worth remembering too. Nothing about the pace of this investigation in his professional experience is actually unusual, aside from the intense public speculation surrounding it. Gathering complete evidence and conducting proper interviews in a case like this commonly takes a week or longer. That doesn't make the wait easier for a grieving family, but it does mean the timeline itself isn't, on its own, evidence that anything has been mishandled. And here's something worth sitting with for a second, because it applies to almost every high-profile case like this one, not just this specific investigation. The public and investigators are almost never operating on the same clock. From the outside, a week of silence can feel like a week of nothing happening. From the inside, that same week might involve a dozen separate interviews being scheduled and conducted one at a time, digital evidence being sent off to a lab, and coordination calls between agencies that never make it into a press release. Silence, in other words, isn't the same thing as inaction. It's just that investigative work is quiet by design, deliberately so, because the moment details start leaking mid-interview, the whole point of separating witnesses collapses. So when you see people online treating the sheriff's slower, more careful update as suspicious purely because it isn't dramatic, keep that distinction in mind. Careful and slow is often exactly what a competent investigation is supposed to look like. Now here's the second major thread in this update, and this one goes straight to the heart of the biggest contradiction in the entire case. Remember what we said at the top. This is the development that could confirm or destroy the story Nolan's friends have been telling. Here's exactly what came out, and exactly what it does and doesn't prove. For weeks, this story has hinged on a single disputed conversation. According to Ben Crump, the young woman Nolan was speaking with told him she was heading back to the boat to rejoin his friends. The friends say the opposite, that Nolan told them he wanted to stay behind with her. That young woman's name is Katie, and her mother, Gracie McCormack, has now confirmed publicly that Katie was indeed the person with Nolan that day. I want to be precise here, because it matters. Katie herself has not given a direct, on-record interview to any outlet that we're aware of. What we have instead is her account, relayed secondhand through her sister and her mother. According to a Facebook post from Katie's sister, Nolan's friends were pressuring him to end his conversation with Katie so he could ride back with them. Katie had a conversation with Nolan, and based on that conversation, assumed he was getting ready to get on the boat he'd originally arrived on. Katie herself made it home safely that day, on a separate boat, with different people. According to the post, she was picked up by her sister's brother and sister-in-law. The post also states that Katie assumed the friends telling Nolan to get on the boat wouldn't have actually left him behind, and it says the family has already given, in their words, all the answers they can give, both to Nolan's mother directly and to authorities. I think it's worth walking through the emotional logic in that account, because it actually helps explain how a situation like this can unfold without anyone necessarily intending harm. If Katie genuinely believed in that moment that Nolan was heading toward the boat, she'd have had no reason to think anything was wrong. She wasn't watching to confirm he actually got on. She simply assumed it, the way anyone would, after a brief conversation ends and the person you were talking to turns and walks in a particular direction. That assumption, reasonable as it may have been in the moment, is exactly the kind of small human gap that can end up mattering enormously afterward, when everyone involved is trying to reconstruct exactly what happened based on assumptions rather than confirmed observations. Katie's mother added her own statement separately, also on Facebook. She confirmed Katie was the young woman with Nolan that day. She said Katie has remained in contact with the Wells family since, but she was also clear about the limits of what her daughter actually knows. Katie has no real insight into what happened to Nolan after the two of them parted ways. That last point matters. Katie's account, even filtered through her family, doesn't claim to know what happened to Nolan afterward. It only speaks to what she believed was happening in the moment she last saw him, that he was heading toward the boat. It's also worth noting how her mother chose to frame the statement overall. She didn't use the moment to defend her daughter against any accusation, because Katie hasn't actually been accused of anything by anyone connected to this case. Instead, the statement reads more like an attempt to correct the record and provide clarity, while also protecting her daughter from further public exposure. That's a meaningfully different posture than the statements we've seen from some of the other families connected to this case. And it's worth keeping that distinction in mind as this story continues to develop. Think about what it would look like if a family were trying to shield their daughter from suspicion, rather than simply correct a public record. You'd expect a carefully lawyered statement, probably issued through an attorney rather than a personal Facebook page, likely emphasizing what the daughter didn't do, or couldn't have known, framed defensively from the first sentence. That's not what this reads like. It reads like a mother filling in a gap in a public timeline because she felt it needed filling in. Nothing more dramatic than that. The absence of defensiveness is itself a small, useful signal, even if it's not proof of anything on its own. So, does this resolve the central contradiction? Not entirely, but it does shift the weight of it. Katie is now a real, named, accounted-for person, not a mystery figure whose very existence was initially in question. Her family, unprompted by any lawsuit or legal pressure, has come forward publicly twice to share what she remembers. And nothing in either statement supports the friend's version that Nolan chose, on his own, to stay behind. At the same time, it's worth being honest about what this isn't. It isn't a sworn statement, it isn't a formal interview transcript. It's 2 Facebook posts from family members, describing what a teenage girl told them about a chaotic afternoon, weeks after the fact. That's meaningfully different from Katie testifying under oath, or giving her own on-record interview to a reporter. Until that happens, this remains an important piece of corroborating context, not a final resolution. And there's a version of this that cuts in a slightly different direction, worth acknowledging honestly. Katie's account, as relayed, doesn't actually claim the friends lied outright either. It's entirely possible that Nolan genuinely intended to head back to the boat when he last spoke with Katie, and that something changed his mind, or interrupted him, in the short window between that conversation and whenever the friends say they last saw him. That would mean both accounts could be sincere and still not fully overlap, simply because they're describing slightly different moments, minutes apart, rather than the exact same instant. That possibility doesn't resolve the underlying mystery of what happened to Nolan, but it's a reminder that contradiction between 2 honest accounts doesn't automatically mean one side is lying. Sometimes it just means nobody was watching closely enough, in the ordinary, unremarkable way people usually aren't, right up until the moment it turns out to matter enormously. There's one more thing worth pointing out about why Katie's family chose to speak up the way they did, through Facebook, through relatives, rather than through a formal statement or an attorney. It's easy to read that choice as evasive if you're looking for a reason to be suspicious, but there's a far more ordinary explanation. Katie is a young woman who, by every account we have, hasn't been accused of anything, isn't a suspect, and has no legal obligation to say anything publicly at all. Coming forward the way her family did, informally, without being compelled, without a lawsuit forcing their hand, actually costs them something. It invites exactly the kind of scrutiny we're giving it right now. People who have something to hide typically don't volunteer information they aren't required to give. That doesn't prove anything on its own, but it's worth weighing against the instinct to treat every second-hand account with automatic suspicion. It's also worth pausing on how easy it would be for this detail to get flattened online into something it isn't. Somewhere out there, by the time you're watching this, there's a decent chance you'll see a comment or a clip claiming, "Katie confirmed the friends are lying," or "Katie's family just exposed the cover-up." Neither of those things is accurate, based on what's actually been said. What's accurate is narrower and, frankly, less dramatic. A family relayed what a teenager believed she saw, weeks after a chaotic afternoon, without directly accusing anyone of anything. Precision matters here specifically, because this case has already shown how quickly a small, careful detail can get exaggerated into a headline it was never meant to support. While all of this has unfolded, the piece of evidence everyone's actually been waiting for still hasn't arrived. The independent autopsy, commissioned by the family and conducted in Washington, D.C., was originally expected to be released on Friday, July 10th. Trump has said that timeline slipped because of issues transporting Nolan's body. As of the most recent reporting available, those results still haven't been made public. The state's own autopsy remains in a similar position. Officials have said toxicology testing alone can take days or weeks, since it's typically sent out to external laboratories rather than processed in-house. The same CNN analyst mentioned earlier said he's personally waited 2 to 3 weeks for toxicology results before, in cases with no particular controversy attached to them at all. I want to be direct about something here, because misinformation has become its own significant thread in this story. Multiple credible outlets, NBC among them, have published pieces specifically about how much false information and unverified speculation has filled the silence around this case, precisely because official results have taken this long to come out. So here's the rule, and it's not a complicated one. Any claim you see online stating the autopsy results are already out, especially ones describing dramatic new findings, should be treated with real skepticism until it's confirmed by a credible, named source. This pattern is worth naming clearly, because it isn't unique to this case. Whenever an investigation involves genuine public interest, real emotional stakes, and a prolonged wait for official findings, that gap tends to get filled by something, whether or not real information actually exists to fill it. Some of what circulates is honest speculation, clearly labeled as such. Some of it is deliberately misleading, crafted to look more authoritative than it actually is, sometimes borrowing real details from the case and mixing them with invented ones, specifically to make the fabrication harder to spot. The responsible approach, and the one we're going to keep taking here, is to wait for confirmation from sources that can actually be verified, rather than repeating claims simply because they're already circulating widely, or because they happen to align with a theory that feels satisfying. It's worth understanding, too, why toxicology in particular takes as long as it does, because that delay tends to get read as suspicious when it's actually just procedural. A standard toxicology panel looks for a narrow set of common substances and can sometimes come back relatively quickly. But when investigators want a comprehensive screen, checking for a much wider range of substances, including ones that require more specialized testing, that work often has to be sent to a small number of specialized labs that handle cases from an entire region, not just one county. Those labs have queues. They don't stop everything to prioritize one case just because it's gotten national attention, and if anything, a high-profile case being rushed through would raise its own separate set of questions about thoroughness. So the wait itself, frustrating as it is for everyone watching, isn't unusual. It's the same wait almost every family goes through in almost every case involving an unclear cause of death, whether or not the case ever makes the news. Trey Shepard, the friend who already came forward publicly to explain his role in the viral confrontation video, addressed this waiting period directly, in his own words. He said everybody needs to let the investigation continue and let the facts actually be shown. He said if those facts show that somebody harmed Nolan, he hopes justice is brought. And if it turns out to have been a tragic accident, one where somebody simply failed to speak up afterward, he said he still hopes justice is brought in that case too. He said the facts are the only thing that's actually going to settle any of this, and that he's waiting patiently to see them before forming any further opinion. He closed by saying, simply, that he knows he's lost his best friend. That's a notably different posture than a lot of the speculation surrounding this case. Shepard isn't defending his friend group as a whole, and he isn't accusing anyone either. He's asking for the same thing Nolan's own parents have asked for from the very beginning, actual answers, rather than more theories. It's a genuinely difficult position to hold publicly, and it's worth appreciating what that actually requires. Shepard has already put his own name and reputation on the line once, correcting the record about the viral video, at real personal risk. Given the death threats he and his friends have described receiving, he could have used this same platform to defend his broader friend group more forcefully, or to push back harder against the growing public suspicions surrounding them. Instead, he's explicitly leaving the door open to either outcome, that someone may have genuinely harmed Nolan, or that this may have been a tragic accident compounded by someone's failure to speak up honestly afterward. Refusing to pick a side before the facts are actually in isn't the same as having nothing to say. In a case this saturated with confident theories from every direction, that kind of deliberate restraint is, in its own way, notable. It's worth contrasting Shepard's approach with the general tone of the online conversation around this case, because the difference is stark. Scroll through any comment section on this story and you'll find no shortage of people who are completely certain. Certain about who's lying, certain about what really happened on that boat, certain about motives nobody outside a small group of witnesses could possibly know. Shepard, who was actually there, who actually knew Nolan, who has more direct knowledge of that day than almost anyone commenting online, is the one person choosing not to claim certainty. That's not a coincidence. People closest to a tragedy often have the least appetite for confident theorizing, because they understand better than anyone how much they still don't know. It's usually the people furthest from an event who feel the most comfortable being certain about it. Quick pause here. If you're new to this case, here's everything else we've already covered in detail, in one place, so the rest of this makes sense. Nolan's phone came back to his family with no saved Snapchat content from that entire day, checked before the 24-hour deletion window had even passed. A viral video, once believed to capture Nolan demanding his phone back, has since been explained differently by a close friend, who says the voice on it is actually his own. A documented photo shows Nolan in blue shorts, contradicting an official report describing black ones. And more than 13 hours passed between the family's initial report and a formal Coast Guard search request. None of those threads have been resolved by this week's developments. They're still sitting there, unanswered, alongside everything new. There's also the question of Judge Ashley Cole's public statement, which described her son Warren's account of the timeline in detail, but notably left out any mention of the phone, the keys, the video, or the deleted messages. And there's the matter of the friends themselves, all of whom retained legal representation early on, and none of whom, according to Crump, have had any direct conversation with the family's legal team since. Every one of these threads represents its own open question, and none of them moves closer to resolution just because two new developments, the FBI's involvement and Katie's family coming forward, have entered the picture this week. If anything, each new thread tends to add another layer to an already complicated picture, rather than simplifying it. It's worth asking, honestly, why a case with this many still open threads holds public attention the way it does, week after week, update after update. Part of it is simply the unresolved nature of it. Human beings are wired to want closure, and a story that keeps generating new details without resolving old ones creates a kind of itch that's hard to ignore. But part of it, too, is that this case sits at an intersection a lot of people recognize from their own lives. A group of friends, a chaotic day, a series of small decisions that felt unremarkable in the moment and only became significant in hindsight. That's precisely why it's so important not to let the emotional pull of the story outrun the actual evidence. The more relatable a case feels, the easier it is to fill in gaps with assumption instead of fact. And we've already seen, over and over in this case specifically, how costly that kind of assumption can be. Before we close this out, there's a small, quiet detail Christine shared in a recent interview. Easy to lose amid everything else in this case, but worth including here. She said the last time she actually saw Nolan in person was July 3rd, the night before the trip. She'd made the family salmon for dinner. He was heading out to spend the night with friends ahead of the holiday weekend. She recalled him saying simply, "Hey Mom, I'm about to go. I love you." A hug, a kiss, and he left. That's the kind of detail that doesn't fit into any theory or timeline dispute. It's just a mother's memory of an entirely ordinary goodbye, the kind every parent has said and heard 1,000 times. That turned out, without anyone knowing it in the moment, to be the last one. It's worth sitting with the contrast there, between the granular, contested detail that makes up the rest of this case. Timestamps, boat routes, who said what to whom, and this one simple, unremarkable memory. Christine has spent the last several weeks in interviews, dissecting Snapchat windows, phone location data, and the exact minute a Coast Guard call was placed. But the memory she keeps returning to isn't analytical at all. It's just her son in a doorway, saying he loved her before he left. That's often what grief actually looks like underneath a public case like this one. Not just the demand for facts and accountability, real and legitimate as that demand is, but also the quiet, private task of holding on to the last ordinary moments before everything else about that day became extraordinary in the worst possible way. There's something almost jarring about how ordinary that final conversation was, precisely because everything that came after it has been anything but ordinary. A mother making dinner, a teenager heading out for a night with friends before a holiday weekend, a quick goodbye at the door, the kind that happens in thousands of households on any given evening, completely unremarkable at the time. No parent replays that exact kind of moment, expecting it to matter later, because if they did, they'd never let their kids out the door at all. It's precisely the unremarkable nature of it that makes it worth pausing on here. Every detail we've covered in this update, timestamps, boat routes, contradicting witness accounts, exists because people are trying to reconstruct a day after the fact, piecing together fragments to understand something that's already happened. But that goodbye didn't need to be reconstructed. It was simply lived, in real time, by two people who had no idea it would be the last one. So, pulling this together, the FBI is now in contact with local investigators, expanding this case beyond a single county sheriff's office. Formal witness interviews are underway, following the standard practice of speaking to each person separately, to check whether every account of that day actually holds together under scrutiny. Katie, the young woman at the center of the original contradiction, has been publicly identified and accounted for, and her family's account, relayed secondhand, does not support the friend's version of what happened. Both autopsies remain pending, with no confirmed release date for either. And in the middle of all of it, a close friend has publicly chosen to wait for the actual facts, rather than add to the speculation, while a grieving mother holds on to the memory of an ordinary goodbye that never got the chance to be followed by another one. There's a broader shape to this case worth naming as we close. Every few days, something new arrives. A witness account, an institutional development, a personal detail from the family, and each one gets absorbed into an already sprawling public conversation about what happened to Nolan Wells. Some of what arrives genuinely moves the case forward, like Katie's family coming forward, or federal investigators now being in contact with local ones. Some of it simply adds texture without resolving anything, like the small human detail of a final dinner and a final goodbye. And some of what circulates isn't reliable at all, and needs to be set aside entirely. Telling those three categories apart, case update, human context, and unverified noise, is exactly the discipline this story requires from anyone trying to follow it honestly. And it's the discipline we're going to keep applying here, update after update, until there's an actual resolution to report. If you want continued fact-based updates on the Nolan Wells investigation, subscribe to Midnight Crime Files and turn on notifications. If you've made it this far, you already understand something a lot of people following this case casually don't. That patience isn't the same as indifference. Waiting for verified facts instead of running with the most dramatic version of events available isn't a failure to care about Nolan or his family. It's actually the opposite. It's a recognition that a young man is dead, that his family deserves an actual answer rather than a satisfying story, and that getting this wrong, attaching blame to the wrong person or the wrong theory because it spread faster online than the truth did, would be its own kind of injustice, layered on top of an already devastating one. We're going to keep following this case. The FBI's involvement, the witness interviews, both sets of autopsy results, and the facts as they're actually confirmed. We'll bring you those facts as we get them verified, and not a moment before.